1 Peter chapter 4. Brother Cadell, I'm going to be real sure this time. Do I have my microphone on tonight? I can hear it already. I know I have my microphone on. We decided I must have turned my microphone on or had my microphone on throughout the entire song service Sunday night, because when I stepped up to preach, I reached in my pocket and flipped the switch like I always do, and I apparently turned it to off when I did that. So it must have been that it was on the entire time until it was time. 1 Peter chapter 4, we're going to start reading in verse 1 this evening. 1 Peter 4, verse 1. For as much then as Christ hath suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves likewise with the same mind. For he that suffered in the flesh hath ceased from sin, that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh to the lusts of men, but to the will of God. For the time past of our life may suffice us to have wrought the will of the Gentiles when we walked in lasciviousness, lust, excess of wine, reveling, banqueting, abominable idolatries, wherein they think it strange that ye run not with them to the same excess of riot, speaking evil of you. Who shall give account to him that is ready to judge the quick and the dead? For this cause was the gospel preached also to them that are dead, that they might be judged according to men in the flesh, but live according to God in the Spirit. But the end of all things is at hand. Be therefore sober, and watch unto prayer, and above all things have fervent charity among yourselves, for charity covereth a multitude of sins. Use hospitality one to another without grudging. As every man hath received the gift, even so minister the same one to another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. We'll go ahead and stop there for right now. Let's have a word of prayer. Lord, I do want to thank you for tonight and for the time we can have in your word tonight, in your house tonight. We can set aside in the middle of the week to come and to hear from you, Lord. And I pray that you'll help this time to be exactly that. I pray that you'll speak through me this evening, Lord. I pray this in your name. Amen. You can go ahead and be seated. I had us read 1 through 10. I considered going even further into the chapter from here, kind of to help us to get the context of the passage that we're in this evening. The entire chapter, and again, we only read verses 1 through 10. You continue on, and it kind of continues with this theme. In fact, my Bible, you know how your Bible will have different sections labeled or divided into different sections. The next section, starting in verse 12, my Bible has it labeled as rejoicing in suffering. Because the entire chapter is in reference to suffering persecution. In reality, a lot of the book of 1 Peter is focused on that, because in the time it was written, persecution was a real issue. Persecution, as we know, then wasn't what it is now. I've mentioned this, I don't know, it seems like in the last few messages now, that it looks like maybe we have the possibility of learning what some real persecution is in the relatively near future, but we haven't faced it. You know, we think of persecution or being persecuted for our faith for my whole lifetime. We look at it and we kind of think, well, someone slammed the door in my face, therefore I was persecuted for Christ. You know, or we get the idea that we are persecuted because, someone got upset at me when I told them I was a Christian. Reality, we call some pretty petty things persecution. I don't know, I kind of find this a little funny, funny not funny, I guess. It was a few years back now that there was all sorts of people screaming religious persecution when Tim Tebow was in the NFL, and he was let go by the Broncos, and everyone was making this big deal that it was religious persecution, that he's let go because he prayed before every game. Well, I hate to break it to you, he also wasn't very good. I'm pretty sure that played a bigger role in him getting let go from a team than the fact that he prayed. Maybe that had some sort of role in it. I don't know. But I don't know that you can say, this is religious persecution. But all sorts of people made this big deal. But he was cut from the team because he prayed, so it's religious persecution. And we kind of get that mindset. But compared to the persecution that the people in book of 1 Peter would have recognized, the things we face are nothing. It's petty. The people that Peter is writing to here, they are facing the real possibility of death for the things that they believe. In fact, Peter, who wrote this book, according to tradition, this is not recorded in the Bible, but according to tradition, Peter was tortured and then crucified upside down for what he preached. I mean, the people who he's writing this letter to, they knew that being a Christian probably meant they would die for what they believed. They understood that being a believer meant that if the wrong person found out what you believed and turned you in, it could get you killed. I mean, they knew what suffering was. These people knew the risks involved in being a Christian and being a child of God and living like it, and they knew what it meant to be persecuted, even to the point of being killed for what they believed. That's the context that we're in here. And he's talking to them, people who understand this subject. He's talking to them about suffering. He is preparing them for what they're going to inevitably face. He's teaching them how to live while facing suffering. Now, realizing that is the context that we have here, I want to move into the message because I think this can really help us this evening. We are, at least in a small way, living, I shouldn't say we all, but I think it's probably accurate, living in some form of suffering. I don't know at this point that it even compares to the suffering that these people are potentially facing, but you compare the freedoms we have now or some of the freedoms we're losing now to the freedoms that we had in the past, and there is some suffering happening. Or as I was studying for this, I thought, well, maybe there's someone here tonight who is suffering some persecution at their work, that you've tried to be a witness and you've tried to reach those around you, and because of it, you are facing persecution. That's a real thing. That happens, that, you're trying to just be a witness and you're just trying to do what God has called you to do, and because of it, again, we're not talking persecution like they're going to have you murdered for it, but you face some persecution for it. It's a challenging thing. How do we go forward? How do we live when we're facing persecution? Maybe there are some that are suffering from personal attacks, that there's some personal attacks causing persecution. I understand what it's like. I've had some. People are funny. People are people-y. I had someone who, it's been a couple of years now, I had someone who got mad at me, and they told me that it was nothing personal. They just didn't like me. It's been a couple of years. I still haven't figured out how that can't be personal. Maybe someone in here understands that better than I do. I don't know. I just like, okay, well, sure. Have a nice day, I guess. No, but let's be honest here. Personal attacks hurt, don't they? No, it's painful. We don't like those. That's some suffering when it is people that you loved or people that you thought you could trust and that would always be on your side, and they attack you. That hurts. That's some suffering. This Monday, Tuesday, my wife and kids and I went up to a preacher's meeting, and one of the preachers, his message was kind of on that side of the subject, looking at David with Absalom and the pain that would cause as a dad to have your kid turning against you like that. Because it's painful when it's someone that you think you can trust that hurts you. That's some suffering. Maybe there's some that's facing personal attacks like that. How do you move forward? Maybe there's someone who's facing physical suffering, pain that you're dealing with, or some sickness or some struggle that you just can't find an answer to. It's hard to know how to push forward when we're living with suffering, no matter what kind of suffering that is. You notice the passage, he does talk about persecution in this chapter, but he words it, and I think intentionally, as suffering. Suffering can be more than just you're being persecuted for what you believe. So how do we live while living in suffering? How do we continue on? Peter teaches them a few things here that I want us to see this evening. When living in suffering, number one, live to God. Look at verse 1 and 2 with me. Chapter 4, verse 1 and 2. For as much then as Christ has suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves likewise with the same mind. For he that has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh to the lusts of men, but to the will of God. Now, look at this with me. It says in verse 2, not for the flesh, not for your will. That is something that we struggle with a lot. Because we all have our will, and we all have our plan, and what we are planning to do, and we have a really hard time letting that go. I've been working with our teens for this summer was 17 years. And with teens, you see it extremely often, that I'll try to talk to the teens about, especially the ones that are getting ready to graduate or are going to be graduating in a year, what their plans are after they graduate and what's going to happen. I very often am given a list of things that they want to do with their lives. There is no in between. There is either, I don't know, or a whole list of things that they plan to do. And very often it's things that I have some years on them and can see, hey, this is a bad idea. Not always. Sometimes they have, thought this out and sought some wisdom before this point, but often it's things that I can look at and say, hey, this is going to lead to some hurt. And I don't know how many times I've tried to give them advice on it and try to keep them from those things that's going to hurt them. But to be honest, most of the time they don't listen because they have their will and they're not letting go of it. They aren't going to listen to me and avoid the dangers, because to do that would mean, well, giving up on some things that I want. And adults aren't a whole lot different. I mean, being in the ministry, we see it all the time. Someone comes to us with what they want to do, and we tell them, hey, I don't think that's a good idea. It could hurt your family. It could hurt your walk with God. I can see dangers in you doing that. And the vast majority of people don't listen. Because to listen means I have to let go of my will. And they know what they want, and they aren't willing to let that go. Peter says, don't live to your will. Tells them, don't live to your will. Don't live to your lust. That's also in verse 2. Your lust, your desires. It's a pretty obvious statement, but somehow we seem to forget this. Our fleshly desires are never good. Those things that come natural to you, those things that your flesh longs for, are never good. I always think it's funny, people, that'll be their excuse. Oh, well, it just came natural to me. Well, your natural man was supposed to be killed when you got saved. Just comes natural to me isn't really an excuse to disobey the Bible. Those things that come natural to you aren't a good thing. I'll give a simple example. My body needs food to live. You need the fuel that food gives to your body, but I'm a junk food guy. Worse than that, I'm a carb guy. I love chips and breads. They are just right down my alley. I try to limit it and exercise because the things I like to eat, I'd be as big as a house. Because while my body needs food to live, and it is necessary that I have food, the food that I want is a potato chip. And all the things that are bad for you. Because the things that your flesh desires are not good. Come on. The things that are good for you are, those, green beans and stuff like that. Green beans are potato chip every time. The things that are good for you, the things that are good for you don't want, but the things that you desire, those aren't good. Now, Peter says you're not to live to the lusts of men. The Bible tells us all sin can be boiled down to one of three groups: lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, pride of life. Notice a pretty important thing here. Two of those three start with lust, a desire. Think in the Bible of those who gave in to their lust, their desires, and the mess that it caused. We could look at tons of examples with it. I think the most glaring and obvious example, at least to myself, would be that of King David, who went on his rooftop, saw a woman bathing, desired her, and because of his lust, he sinned with her, he lied to a nation, he killed her husband, a child died, and who knows how many others died in the battle that he placed Uriah in so that he would die. All because David decided to live to his lust. Peter says you're not to live to the flesh, your will. You're not to live to your lusts, your desires. So what am I to live to? It tells him in verse 2, live to God. The very end of verse 2, but to the will of God. Notice it doesn't say live for God. It says live to God. Seems like when we just read it, and I think most of the time our mind kind of automatically puts for in there, but it says live to, directed at, pointed at. An example would be simply this: if I am driving, I don't drive for Seattle, I drive to Seattle. That's where I'm pointing my car. That's a bad example because I try to avoid Seattle, but we're going to stick with it. But it's where I'm pointing my car. It's the direction I take. It's where my attention is. Which is exactly how we are to be living to God, that my life is pointed to Him. So that everything that I do points to Him. My life is directed to God. The direction of my life, the way that I am going to go, the path that I'll take is directed to Him, by Him. And I am to live so that my attention, my focus, and my eyes are on Him. But it doesn't just say to live to God, but specifically to live to the will of God. Think of it this way, that if I am living my life to fulfill His desires, and that really ought to be the goal of every Christian. It ought to be what you and I are striving for. Not that I can fulfill my desires, not that I can attain the things that I want, or the goals that I want, or the places that I want. Not that I can, reach some monumental place in men's eyes, but that in my life I would do what God desires for me. Peter's given them how they ought to live through pain, through suffering. He starts with live to God. Second thing I want to see, it tells them live for others. Look at verse 7 through 10 with me. But the end of all things is at hand. Be ye therefore sober and watch unto prayer. Above all things, have fervent charity among yourselves, for charity shall cover the multitude of sins. Use hospitality one to another without grudging, as every man hath received the gift, even so minister the same one to another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. This makes me think of Philippians 2, verse 3. Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem other better than themselves. Living for others. Living for other people is an idea, is a concept that is completely foreign to people now. And it kind of seems to be getting worse all the time. We're all about me. What I can get and what I can do, and I. And if something that I do that I want happens to help someone else along the way, well, I guess that's fine, but all we really care about is that I get what I want. You see examples of that every time we drive down the road. You spend any time on the road at all, and you hear people honking at one another, or you hear people yelling out the window at each other because they're upset that this is supposed to be all about me, and me getting home is more important than anyone else, and you're slowing me down. You're at a red light, it turns green, and you are hitting the gas pedal hard within 5 seconds, and the guy behind you is hitting his horn because you're slowing him down. He's in a hurry, and you're messing that up. When I learned to drive a manual. My dad had a unique method of teaching me that he had me drive in the church parking lot for, I don't know, not long enough that he apparently felt comfortable doing this. And he drove me to the South Hill Mall and told me, I want you, it was 5 o'clock at night, so, rush hour, and told me, I want you to drive down Meridian all the way to 176th in rush hour with the stoplights, first time driving your manual transmission. And then he got out. My mom picked him up, and he rode home with her. And I spent the entire time killing that thing in stoplights and getting honked at and yelled at by everyone because I was slowing them down. It worked, by the way. By the time I got to 176, I was pretty proficient with a manual transmission and never had a problem again. I figured it out. Enough people yell at you and honk at you, and you learn real fast. But why do people get upset? Why is it that they're getting angry about that? Because they don't care about other people. They just care about me. It's a foreign idea to us. Peter teaches not living for self, but living for others. And he tells them to live for others in a few different ways in the passage that we read. He tells them to have charity. We saw that in verse 8. Above all things, have fervent charity among yourselves, for charity shall cover the multitude of sins. Charity is love, but specifically is a love for your church. He mentions among yourselves. It's in the church that he's talking to. Loving people, and I've said this in messages before, loving people, even sometimes in your church, is hard. I get that. You put any group of people in one building with this many different personalities and backgrounds and styles and jobs and whatever else, you're just not all going to see the same thing. You're not all going to see eye to eye. I mean, think about it. There are some people who just by nature are happy, bubbly people, which I find that wonderful. Like I'm trying as I use examples not to look at anyone, so I'm going to stare at the floor at this section. I honestly do. I find it great. It always makes me smile, and doesn't matter what's going on. If they're that bubbly and happy, you can't help but be happy. There are some people who find happy people annoying. I don't understand that, but somehow they do. Some people in this church enjoy different hobbies than others do, and some have very strong opinions about what their hobbies are and what they do and don't like. It wasn't that long ago that I preached a message here, and I used an example, and the example I used was about hunting, and I had someone get mad at me because they didn't like what my hobby was. We're all different. I understand that sometimes that can make loving people hard if you're living for you. Here's what I have learned. When I struggle loving someone how I should, or when I talk to people who are struggling with loving someone else in the church, it always comes down to one thing. The focus was self. But they can't love that person because you don't know what they said to me. I can't love that person because you don't know what they did to me. It seems to all come back to me. But if I'm living to God and for others, I can love others. It tells them to live for others by having charity. It tells them to live for others by having hospitality. We see that in verse 9. Use hospitality one to another without grudging. Now, my wife is in here. She'll tell you hospitality is a weakness of mine. I am just that person. I don't like having people over to my house. My house is where, I love you people. My house is where I escape. Just joking a little bit. No. But it is. Like I don't know, I'm one of those. My house is my safe zone. It's where I can relax, and I can't do that if people are in my house. I've told my wife for years, I much prefer going to other people's house, because if I'm in their house and I'm sick of talking to them, I can leave and go home. But they find it rude when I tell them I'm sick of talking, you get out of my house. So it just works better. I don't know. Did you notice how many times I said I in there? I'm just being honest here. The reason that I struggle with hospitality, the reason that you do too, is because you're looking at I. We're living for me, not others. Peter tells the church, live for others, love others, have hospitality to others. Tells them minister to others. We see that in verse 10, as every man hath received the gift, even so minister the same one to another. I know it's been said here before, I probably said it before, but church isn't for you just to come and get ministered to. It's not what it's all about, and yet there are people who come to churches all the time who have that mentality with, that mindset of that I'm here so that I can be ministered to. But ministering isn't a one-way street. Peter says minister one to another. One to another cannot be defined as me up here ministering to all of you. That wouldn't be one to another. No, ministering one to another means you ministering to you, ministering to you, ministering to you, ministering to you. It means, and on it goes, it means ministering to each other, to other people. Living for others, not just focusing on going to church to see what I can get, but going to church to see what I can give, what I can do for someone else. I understand that we come to church to worship God, and we come to church to be fed, and we come to church to be to hear from God, and those are vital. But it would change church if each one of us came here with the mindset that I'm going to look for a way to be a blessing to someone today. I mean, if we came to church really with the mindset of I am going to come to church today and I'm going to look for a way that I can be a blessing to someone else. I'm going to look for a way to minister. That doesn't have to be big things. I didn't ask him if I could. I'm going to use Brother Coffee as an example. Brother Coffee has had a ministry for years in this church that most probably don't even realize is a ministry. I don't know that he even sees it as a ministry. It is minimal, but has been a blessing to me. He started when I first started preaching Wednesday nights, that I would often forget to put my microphone on. So he would make sure to remind me to put my mic on. Preaching every week was new to me. I forgot often, so he would, I don't know, all sorts of things. He'd walk in and he'd be looking across the room and tapping on his lapel, trying to get my attention to make sure I saw. Even when we, COVID was around and wasn't able to be in the auditorium, he would text me often. I'd be sitting on the platform and I'd get a text from Brother Coffee, Mike, because he couldn't see it with the camera. He couldn't see if I had it on or not, because he was trying to remind me. At this point, I rarely forget, but he still checks to make sure that I have it on. I know it seems little, but I can't tell you how much it means to me. It ministers to me. It doesn't have to be huge things. We often get this mindset of, man, if I'm going to minister to someone, but that's going to take a lot. I'm going to have to put a lot of time and effort in it. No, it doesn't always have to be these giant things to be able to be a blessing to someone. Peter is teaching Christians how to live through suffering. Tells them, live to God, live for others. Then lastly tonight, live rejoicing. Let's look at verse 12 through 16. I know we didn't read this earlier, but verse 12 through 16. Beloved, think it not strange concerning the fiery trial, which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened unto you. But rejoice, inasmuch as ye are partakers of Christ's suffering, that when his glory shall be revealed, ye may be glad also with exceeding joy. If ye be reproached for the name of Christ, happy are ye. For the Spirit of glory and of God resteth upon you. On their part he is evil spoken of, but on your part he is glorified. But let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or as an evildoer or as a busybody in other men's matters. Yet if any man suffer as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God on this behalf. Now, I'm just going to say this, starting this point off. Those verses, 12 through 16, sometimes seem impossible to us, don't they? I mean, you read that. He's talking about fiery trials. Don't think, it's some strange thing. Rejoice in it. You're reproached. Happy are ye. You're suffering. Let it not be ashamed, but glorify God. I mean, Those are challenging things. We're supposed to rejoice in suffering. Now, before someone says, yeah, but you don't know what I'm going through. You don't know my struggles. You don't know the suffering that I've either been through or the suffering that I have right now. Again, remember our context here. We're talking about while they are suffering persecution, which makes this a lot harder. Breaks it into those three sections. Rejoice in fiery trials. We just saw that in 12 and 13. Hey, fire is not fun. It can be fun to play with. I think every guy has a little bit of pyro in them, but fire is not fun when it burns you. I've had experiences where I've played with fire and gotten a little too close, and it's not fun. I have scars on my arms from working when I was in soldering in a place that I couldn't move, and you have molten metal dropping on your arm. Hey, fire hurts. Burning does not cause me to rejoice. This week, I told you we drove up to a preacher's meeting in Tonasket, and Tuesday morning we got there early so that we could help the pastor there get things set up. It's a small church, so they needed some help, so my family showed up early, and we're going to try and help them get set up, and they were setting up everything for lunch and trying to get that all prepped, and the smoker that they were using was not working. So we decided we were going to take it apart and try to clear the obstruction that was making it so that the pellets couldn't get through, and we quickly learned while it was not working, the hot box was working quite well. It was very hot. Burning does not cause me to rejoice. It hurts. I've read enough stories of the martyrs who were burned at the stake, which undoubtedly is what Peter is referring to know that may be coming, or to be in that situation would not cause me to want to rejoice. But they aren't rejoicing because of the fire. They can rejoice because they are partakers with Christ. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but it reminds me of the disciples rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer in his name. He tells them, rejoice in fiery trials. He tells them, be happy in reproach. Verse 14, if ye be reproached for the name of Christ, happy are ye. Reproach is when someone comes to you in disappointment or disapproval. It's when someone rails on you because they don't like what it is that you're doing or what it is that you're saying. Maybe I'm alone in this. I don't think I am. But people yelling at me does not make me happy. My first response when someone gets in my face and yells at me is not to smile and, boy, this is a great day. So how can I be happy in reproach? Lays it out for you. The Spirit of God resteth on you. I can be happy in suffering. I can rejoice in fiery trials. I can be happy in reproach because God is there with me, and I'm not facing the fiery trial alone, and I'm not facing the reproach alone. Tells them, rejoice in fiery trials, be happy in reproach. Tells them to glory in suffering. Verse 16, yet if any man suffer as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God on this behalf. No one likes suffering. I mean, there is nothing fun about that. When I have an example there, and this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to read my example. I can't remember why I put this example in there or how it possibly ties in. So I'm as curious as you are. So I'm going to read my example and figure out why this is here, why I wrote that. But I think I know where I'm headed with this. No one likes suffering. I mean, I just wrote it earlier today. How I forget these things, I have no idea. No one likes suffering. When Bo and I were kids, my parents they'd let us wrestle, and I've always wanted to do this with my kids, but I'm terrified of the outcome. My parents would let us wrestle in the backyard with no rules or no supervision. We could just wrestle. And we were brothers, so our only rules were we're boys, not girls. Don't pull hair, don't bite. Everything else is fair game. Go. Bo is 2.5 years older than I am, so he was always bigger than me, and always had that advantage. People always told my brother that he needed to get me to fear him when we were young because someday I'd be bigger than him, and that day never came, which was very disappointing because he got his licks in for sure, thinking that someday I was going to outgrow him. I'm 36 years old. I've given up on the idea. I don't think it's going to happen now. But when we'd wrestle, I was smaller, so that's where it ties in, so I would suffer. Bo's go-to move, he was bigger than I was. Bo's go-to move was he'd wrap his legs around my stomach, and he'd lock his ankles, and he'd just squeeze the air out of my lungs anytime I tried to squirm, anytime I tried to move. I was stubborn, so I refused to give up. So he would just do that until I would pass out, and then he would let go. Like, this was what I was suffering and didn't like it. And no one likes to suffer. I was stubborn and still never did stop. I will admit it, I was that annoying little brother. He would stop because he thought I was going to die, and as soon as he'd stop, I'd be like, I won, you gave up. He's like, well, no, I had you pinned. Obviously, I won. Yeah, but you tapped out. I didn't, so I won. That's all that matters. That had nothing to do with anything. I just felt like throwing that one in there. No. Nobody likes suffering. Nobody likes pain. Nobody likes struggle. So how do I glory in that? How do I glory in that? How do I move forward living? How do I glory in those struggles? By bringing the glory to God. Again, Peter knew a little bit about this. This is where I said earlier, I don't want to get ahead of myself. Acts 5, verse 40 through 42. And to him they agreed, and when they had called the apostles and beaten them, they commanded that they should not speak in the name of Jesus and let them go. Catch this. And they departed from the presence of the council, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer shame for his name. And daily in the temple and in every house they ceased not to teach and preach Jesus Christ. And one of the people in this was the man who's writing this book, who rejoiced that he was counted worthy to suffer. How do we do that? By pointing the attention and the focus to God. It's not about me. So, conclusion this evening. Peter, writing to these Christians, he gives them, I guess if you will, he gives them a little how-to book, how to live in suffering. Because as I said at the start of the message, that's a struggle for us. We have things that maybe we are suffering with, and very often it's how do I move forward? How do I keep going? Live to God, live for others, and live rejoicing. And I can do that regardless of the suffering, even in the trial, even in reproach, even when it hurts and those times that I don't know how I can get through. And I can because God is there. The times that I struggle and the times that you struggle with how do I get through this suffering are the times that I'm focused on I. If my focus is on God, and I am, as we started the message with, living to Him, all the rest of that doesn't matter. And I can live rejoicing, and I can live glorying, and I can live happy because I'm living for Him, to Him, not me. Let's pray. Lord, I pray that you'll help us to really grasp a hold of this, Lord. It really is it sounds simple, but it's a challenging concept for us. We go through things that are suffering, whether it is persecution or whether, as I said at the start, whether it's personal things or physical things or all sorts of different areas, and we go through things that we would consider suffering, and it's hard for us to push forward. It's hard for us to live rejoicing. It's hard for us to be happy. And it's because our focus is on us. Lord, help us to recognize when going through times of suffering, I can keep moving forward. I'm not living to me. Help us to decide, I'm going to live to God. I'm going to live for others. Regardless of what's happening in my world around me, I'm going to live rejoicing because He is there. I don't have to live doing this on my own, and I don't have to struggle with this on my own. He's there, and He'll carry me through. It's in your name.